And welcome to my presentation. Just a little repeat of my PhD defense, my presentation on digital media and behavioural addiction. Where does use become problematic? I hope to give you all a little bit of a talk about me, about what I've done or been doing as a PhD student within this program, within the RMIT PhD program, and hopefully be a little entertaining as well along the way. Just to give a little bit of an introduction to myself, my name is Deon, and it's a pleasure to meet you all, or I guess to talk to you all who are listening on YouTube. I've completed a Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Honours in Psychology beforehand, and I'm currently completing a Master's of Professional Psychology that I've commenced alongside this PhD. Now, during the course of this PhD, what have I been doing? I've been learning new skills, taking part in activities I never would have dreamed of years ago. I've published papers in Q1 journals with leaders in the field of addiction psychology, such as Kai Mueller, Sean Watson, Wai Chen, and of course my supervisors, Bruno, Rapson Gomez, Jo Doley, with a further 2 articles in preprint. And in the course of doing so, I've gained 24 citations and a total 1.859 FWCI. Every single one of my publications has been Q1, and these same journals that I publish with, such as Psychiatric Research, Addictive Behavior Reports, BMC Psychology, and so on, I regularly complete reviews for, in addition to journals like Current Psychology, which I've explored as an option. 2 more papers are in the final stages of drafting right now. Longitudinal network analysis with Rapson Gomez, and a meta-analysis with Mark Griffith. And I consult with scholars from Poland to Australia on statistics, sometimes completing their analysis and results sections for them. That has yet to result in a paper under my belt, but I really look forward to at least 2 additional publications as a result of my statistical advice and assistance for our people. That's where the rest of this talk comes in. What am I really here to talk about? It's not just me. It's about my project, about what I'm doing. I'll be giving you a little bit of a literature review, just talking about, what is it that my project was about. I'll be moving into a discussion of what question is informed by literature, and discussing what methods might be necessary before I discuss each paper that makes up this project individually, and finally discuss what it all implies, what should be done next, and what I personally need to be doing going forward. Which brings us to our topic today, and our protagonist, or antagonist if you like, digital media. Now, the term digital media describes all communications transmitted over the internet. Text, image, video games, all things that we've done in one respect or another. But what really makes digital media special, what makes it interesting, is that it has certain characteristics that are utterly unique compared to all other forms of media. Firstly, it's extremely easy and cheap to access. A click of the mouse puts infinite video, pictures, and text at your fingertips, requiring very little capital investment or time investment. And secondly, digital media is all-encompassing. Almost any form of communication that you can think of is conducted via digital media. It offers a constant connection that is nigh inescapable, and entertainment from any place at any time. And perhaps most critically, digital media is interactive. You can comment on people's work, you can like, you can comments, you can share, you can shoot your enemies in a video game, etc. Digital media accepts your inputs. You're part of it. And so what does all this do? It makes digital media incredibly salient. It taps into deep-seated primal desires baked into our biology. Things like sex, adventure, community, and so on. It can provide all these things, and it does so in an extremely easy manner. Way too easy compared to what we evolved for, that evolved environment. And not only is it easy, it becomes catered, it grows and evolves around needs. Algorithms are constantly trying to adapt to our inputs to, perfectly sell things to our requirements, our personal characteristics, and so on. And what does all this do? It creates a evolutionary mismatch between our desires for these things and the accessibility of them in our environment. You know, which has made digital media enormously popular, as you might imagine. Unfortunately, this enormous change in how we relate with one another may not necessarily be a positive one. Digital media can have numerous positive effects on well-being. Digital mediums like social media or video games can serve as spaces in which one can form and reestablish and reinforce a social network. Especially if you can't find one in real life, it can give you that. It can substitute. It can help build careers and educate, and like we're doing right now. It can help aid in your identity formation. You discover who you are and what you like, and so on, and you can build skills. And it's almost like a scaffold, helping one improve in certain cases when you don't have certain abilities. It can help you build them up. However, there are also many negative effects that have begun to come to light as of late. These negative effects are both to characteristics unique to these mediums, the lack of privacy, the intense social comparison that we see on social media, for example, think Instagram, but also due to the amount of time taken up by these tasks, which could be used for more wholesome and fulfilling tasks. I don't have it here at the moment, but I'm pretty sure when I was researching this for another paper a while back, I was just writing down stats for this, and the average Australian is spending anywhere from 6 to 7 hours a day just on their smartphone. Just on their smartphone. You think about the amount of time that's taken up, over a month, over a year, which could be used on different things. Learning a skill, learning an instrument, talking to people in real life, which is certainly a different experience to over text. And thus, what we're seeing in certain users is that the use of digital media can result in negative moods, developing into mood disorders. It can create eating disorders and compromise your identity in the same way that it can help give you one. It can rattle the one that you've got and make it more unstable and make it harder for you to feel like you belong somewhere. It can result in a reduction of one's social relationships, the number of them, the health, and create sleep issues. How many times have you been up all night looking at a screen? I know I've certainly been up looking at screens for a very long time, and all these things add up. It can create a lack of physical activity, extreme political development, and more. It's not necessarily having a positive effect. And in particular, in some people, we talked about the environmental mismatch before, but in some people, we're actually seeing symptoms not dissimilar to addiction. Here I've got a picture just showing the results of a study in which the brain scans of people with alcoholism versus digital media addictions were compared, and we found that they're actually very, very similar. Why is this? That environmental mismatch. These things at the very least you theorize, can potentially be addictive, and we see these symptoms in certain people. So these users who are suffering negative symptoms as a result of their digital media use, they're said to be engaging in problematic digital media use. Unfortunately, however, it's still unknown what exactly constitutes that problematic use. What is it that's having this effect? A certain threshold of hours isn't enough. There are people who spend many, many hours over the average on social media, for example, or video games, and they don't necessarily suffer these effects. So we know it's something else. It's or at least it's something more. It's not just the hours of use. And we know that there are people who spend less time than the average, and they do suffer these effects. So, what is it? well, a number of models have been put forth to explain what constitutes as problematic digital media use, and they generally fit into one of the two camps you kind of see on your screen right now. There are models which define problematic use in terms of the number of unhealthy motivations for use and context for use, which and these motives and contexts are what cause problematic patterns of digital media use. Kaplan's four-factor generalized problematic internet use model, or GPIU, is one such model, and you can think of it as what would a motivation be? I want to compare myself to others. Context might be I'm using it in the car while I'm driving. You can imagine that you can see how these would come together to create a problematic type of digital media use. But that's only really one type of model. And it's not the most popular. The one that is more popular, the model that is models that define problematic digital media use in terms of behavioral addiction symptoms. Usually the 6 set out by Griffiths, those being salience, mood modification, tolerance, withdrawal, conflict, and relapse. Well, how would I put it into words? Salience. How important is it? Do you use social media or digital media to make yourself feel better or feel a certain way? Do you need more of it to get the same effect? Do you get withdrawal symptoms if you try to stop? And does it impact your life, your social or video game, or just digital media use in general? And relapses, well, when you try to quit, do you end up falling right back into those behaviors? So yeah, those are the behavioral addiction symptoms, and that's what we kind of tend to imagine as a behavioral addiction model. It's those behaviors, and these models, models that use those symptoms, are the most popular conceptualization of problematic digital media use employed today. Unfortunately, they are also extremely controversial. Those models have been described by opponents as premature pathologization of ordinary behavior. There are scientists who use those models who kind of hit back by just asserting that. Scientists who see this as a very kind of unclear and invalid definition of problematic digital media use would point to the lack of direct damage done by digital media use in contrast to, say, an addictive substance. They'd point to the high variability of results in the literature considering the addictiveness of digital media. And then point to the lack of longitudinal research proving social media use is the cause of the prior identified negative outcomes. They'd point to the low incidence of individuals seeking aid for digital media addictions and the strong comorbidity between excessive digital media use and affective disorders like depression, which might imply that problematic digital media use is a secondary symptom of those affective disorders, a way of coping or an expression of individual traits rather than an actual addiction, an actual addictive substance. On the other hand, people who like and proponents of this behavioral addiction model of problematic digital media use, they would point to the presence of addiction symptoms in excessive users. They'd point to the brain chemistry that I mentioned earlier, the structure of brains of these excessive users, which mimics that of substance addicts. They'd point to the similar behavioral patterns and risk factors shared between excessive users of digital media and substance addicts. All of this would point to as proof that this is an actual addiction. And unfortunately, there's no real resolution to this debate. Knowing the exact structure of problematic digital media use would aid in its assessment and formalizing treatment and so on, but it's simply not in the cards at the moment. And why is that? It's because this is a relatively new field. The data simply isn't there to confirm one understanding over another. And while we've begun to explore comorbidities, to develop models to conceptualize the problematic use. We've begun to validate measures or study how the hours of digital media use one engages in might interact with negative symptoms. But we haven't actually been able to formally assess these different models against each other. And this method that's employed so often at the moment, measuring hours of use against some secondary symptom, it doesn't really have the high specificity required to help us in this endeavor in identifying what the conceptualization is. We still don't know the theoretical of what exactly problematic digital media use is, which hurts our practical ability to identify, treat, or prevent it. Thus, a number of research needs in the field become obvious. There is a need to investigate what constitutes problematic digital media use. There's a need to investigate whether it can be labeled a behavioral addiction, to identify ways in which we as clinicians can manipulate social media use to maximize positive outcomes and minimize negative outcomes, and to do so by filling gaps in research methodology, such as by using longitudinal research and measures with more specificity than digital media screen hours. And it's these needs which have really inspired my research questions in my particular study. With the behavioral addiction model being the most widely employed model, and certainly the one with the most developed tools for its measurement, what I'm going to be looking for is to examine that model critically and answer the question, what is the structure of problematic digital media use, and does it support the behavioral addiction model? And in order to answer that question, I've given myself 3 methodological stipulations that help address certain lacks in the field. Firstly, I'd like to use direct measures of behavioral addiction symptoms rather than by use hours of use, as I've done in many other studies. That way I can basically just directly test the models and more broadly assess the kinds of experience people are having with video games and social media, rather than just the amount they use social media. Secondly, I'd like to employ methods like latent class analysis and network analysis, just that allow for an examination of the way symptoms are experienced and interact with one another. Analyses that allow one to check whether the predictions implicit in these models are expressed in reality. And thirdly, I just like to make sure that at least one of my studies is longitudinal. It's something that's lacking in the field. And this was what brings us to the first study in this project and my first research question, which is, what are the expressions of internet gaming disorder? How do they relate to well-being? Now, I'm asking this as this particular question allows me to just examine whether it allows me to examine one of the biggest submediums within the umbrella of digital media, which is video games. And it really allows me to kind of look at profiles of use, the different ways that people use video games, and whether or not those ways fit within the predictions of the behavioral addiction model. So what I did in this first study was target 1,032 gamers and measure them on their experience of addiction symptoms as measured by the Internet Gaming Disorder short form, and their experience of certain measures of social engagement before engaging in a latent class analysis of that gamer data. Now, the Internet Gaming Disorder scale just captures negative behaviors associated with video games that are predicted by the behavioral addiction model. There's 9 criteria here that measure 9 symptoms based on the substance addiction criteria: preoccupation, withdrawals, tolerance, inability to stop, loss of interest, persistence, deception, escapism, and negative life outcomes. That's a lot of words. But sum it up, it's the same kind of stuff that we talked about before. What are the those basic behavioral addiction symptoms? It's just extended a bit. And basically what we're asking here is, are people preoccupied? Do people think about video games a lot? Do they have those withdrawal symptoms? Do they need more of a time to get the same effect? Can they stop? And are they suffering from a loss of interest in other activities as a result of their gaming? Do they persist despite the fact that bad things are happening to them because of this gaming? Are they lying to others about it? Do they use it for the purposes of escapism? And are they suffering negative effects in their life as a result of their video game use? For example, are they losing out on social relationships because they're just not talking to people anymore, in real life at least? On the other hand, the secondary measure I had, social engagement, represents the degree to which any individual engages with ordinary formative social experiences, vital for well-being. This is kind of a measure of basic overall well-being, of one's ability to integrate into the wider society, and in so doing, to help form that profile of social engagement. And to help us form that profile of social engagement, of their ability to integrate. We gathered information on the exact employment status, education level, living status, and relationship status of our participants. Now, with those variables decided, I employed a latent profile analysis, an analysis in which the responses of a sample in a single measure, in this case on the IGD short form, were examined, distinct homogeneous groupings of responses identified if they're present in the data, and we do that for a process of elimination. So how does that work? What does that look like? I've got a little bit of an example here for you. I've created this kind of hypothetical set of data. Scores on 4 symptoms are arrayed here, and what we'll be doing with such a data set is just looking at, do there appear to be subsets of results in the data? And we'd look for it. We'd say, hey, look, is it just one group here? Are they all part of the same group? Well, this doesn't really fit the data. So we'd discard that model, and we'd look at the next one. Here's 2. It doesn't fit. We'd discard that and move on. Here's 3. It seems to fit with the data. And so we would say these are 3 distinct subgroups, and we'd identify all the individuals present or in those subgroups, and would array them out. We'd divide them into these homogeneous subgroups, which we could test against each other, and which would allow us to look at, how do people in these subgroups experience these symptoms differently. In the case of this particular study, after we ran that analysis, 4 such profiles were identified, each displayed here on the graph, and featuring a roughly similar pattern of symptom experience, though they varied in terms of the degree to which they experienced these symptoms. Membership was staggered across these groups, with the aversive class that barely seemed to engage with video games at all, or at least suffered almost no symptoms of unhealthy video game use, hovering around a minimum score of 1, only making up about 11% of the sample, which makes sense. These are gamers. But the majority of those gamers settled within the normative class, which hovered around a score of 2, rarely suffering negative symptoms related to internet gaming disorder. Only roughly 9% of the gamers in this sample appear to have regular experiences of internet gaming disorder symptoms, and this class was called the high IGD risk group. And examining what their social engagement looked like, we get a slightly different picture of what their life might look like than is typically understood. Now, these individuals were more likely to be unemployed, yes, but unlike prior research, which has found an association between gaming and education, it appears that at this high-risk level, secondary or technical level of education is most common, unlike what you might expect. Typically we think of higher education, kind of nerdiness, as some lay people might put it. We typically expect that to be more associated with a high degree or problematic degree of gaming. So surprising. We also found that these people are often in transient, unsafe accommodations, or they're living with a single parent, perhaps implying that a certain instability in one's lifestyle might be implicated in IGD. Interestingly, there was no relationship between romantic status and risk level. Now, in terms of implications, this theoretically supports the behavioral addiction model, as the classes we identified were so-called severity classes. They each shared the same relative level of each symptom, but progressed steadily in intensity. With each rung, we went up, which would imply a unitary, single construct, IGD, rather than the effects of varying unhealthy contexts, motivations, and personal flaws. So it really looks like it's one thing there. We also saw that loss of control displayed the greatest variation from one class to another. It might be a factor that distinguishes risky from healthy gaming behaviors. And of course, we've created that profile of what an unhealthy gamer might look like. All, of course, having the practical effect of assisting assessment. If we know what high risk looks like, it can be more easily identified and thus treated. Your interventions can be targeted at loss of control, at its particular profile, lifestyle that might be making things worse. We can tailor treatment. All of which brings us to our second question, which mirrors the first, but with a different topic and a different secondary focus. I asked, what are the expressions of social media addiction? How do they relate to comorbid addiction? And this one again was inspired by the importance of the medium, social media, but also by questions regarding the difference between so-called technical and digital addictions and other behavioral addictions. By examining comorbidity with a range of addictions, I can learn if such distinctions truly exist. And so, I sampled 968 English-speaking Australians familiar with gaming on their social media addiction symptoms, and also on their experience of symptoms pertaining to a semi-comprehensive list of addictions. Gamers were targeted because of their high tech literacy and rates of social media use. And once I targeted them and delivered these questionnaires, we ran a latent class analysis like the prior study, but then we also used ANOVA to create a hierarchy of associations between social media addiction and the symptoms and experience of other addictions. All of these were measured with verified measures such as the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale, which you see before you. And each of these had a limited number of items, each pertaining to a different addiction symptom. In the case of social media addiction, the ones we explored before: salience, tolerance, mood modification, relapse, withdrawal, and conflict. Thus, I ran a latent class analysis of SMA symptoms, and when I did, it returned the following three classes that you see on your screens now, which also varied according to severity rather than according to different modes of symptom experience. And like in my first study, the high-risk group was but a small proportion of those tested, with one of the symptoms in particular, withdrawal in this case, displaying a markedly greater degree of difference between risk groups than that of the other symptoms, thus indicating that it's maybe more of a distinguisher between risk groups. The subsequent ANOVA tests compared membership in the low, moderate, and high risk groups on their various levels of addictive behaviors. And in doing so, what we did was build a hierarchy of association that you see before you now, identifying which addictions associated more strongly, or to the degree to which they associated, with social media addiction risk subclass, or at least I should say. And it returned the results you see before us now. It identified internet and shopping addiction in particular as being strongly associated with SMA risk, and exercise and smoking addiction in particular as being aversive of social media addiction. And once again, these results had some very interesting theoretical implications. It implied that social media addiction was a unitary, singular construct which supported its existence, much in the same way that we've supported the existence of internet gaming disorder. And furthermore, as we can see, compared against each other, we can create that hierarchy of associations. We can see which addictions appear to be more associated with social media addiction than others. And what we found was that while internet addiction was, of course, the strongest association, internet addiction contains social media addiction within it. But the second highest association was shopping addiction, which was more strongly associated with social media addiction than other tech addictions, like gaming disorder, which implies that there isn't a distinction between tech and digital addictions, that this distinction maybe doesn't exist, or maybe that they're changing distinctions. Maybe the traits of an at-risk individual that drive them towards social media also does so towards shopping addiction. But what if oh god, it's so hard to describe this. I'm enthusiastic. But what if it's in fact that shopping addiction is becoming more like social media and vice versa? What we see is that shops are being integrated into social media. We see that there are advertisements for shops on social media and so on. We also see that the subgroups of people, for example, young women who are very vulnerable to social media addiction, are also very vulnerable to shopping addiction. So, what is the relationship there? It's difficult exactly to tease out what exactly it is, but there's a lot of implications, a lot of interesting implications about what the relationship might be, and perhaps how it might be changing. And all of this, of course, leads into my last question, in which I thought I'd change tactic, examine problematic use of digital media from a formative experience perspective, which is to say, from the perspective of symptoms affecting symptoms, asking in what ways do the symptoms of social media addiction interact with one another and influence comorbidity? How do symptoms create symptoms? And when you know that, when you can examine that, when you can understand that process and trace the pathway of symptoms affecting symptoms, it allows you to check are these things distinct? If you've got a network, if you're examining the symptoms of, say, distress and SMA or something like that, and these things will strongly correlate and influence themselves than each other, distress to SMA or SMA to distress, it implies they're separate, but you can also trace the pathway of that influence, trace the pathway of that effect, and find an originating point. What creates this, what starts this, it helps with treatment. And so I created this longitudinal network analysis. I sampled around 500 English-speaking adults aged 16 to 64 on their social media addiction experience, as measured by the Bergen Social Media Addiction Scale, like the last experiment. But this time, as a secondary focus, I examined distress symptoms as a secondary measure, both because of the strong association previously identified between distress and SMA, but also because I'm trying to examine a broad range of factors that impact excessive use of digital media in these studies. And I really want to apologize for my kind of stuffy nose at the moment. God's been with me forever. Anyway, because of the suggested causal link between distress and SMA, it's been theorized by skeptics of the behavioral addiction model that SMA, social media addiction, might in fact be a secondary symptom of distress. You feel sad, you feel stressed, you feel anxious, and as a result, you cope through social media use. And so, the method I chose, that longitudinal network analysis, would allow me to examine the relationship between these two concepts, but also between the symptoms there. It's a finer examination of at the symptom level instead of at the conceptual level, in which you examine the symptoms of a disorder through the creation of a network. You create this graphical network based on partial correlations where you have nodes which represent individual symptoms or factors, and then you have edges between these nodes which represent the relationships between them, with thicker edges representing stronger relationships and nodes with more and thicker edges being known as central. They're important. They have influence on the symptoms around them. And by doing this longitudinally, by testing this at 2 time points, I could assess whether there were changes over time. And of course, here we have an example network where you have an example longitudinal network analysis in which you can see there is a depression and OCD subnetwork. They've got all their symptoms there, and it's all graphically kind of represented there. Different nodes are symptoms, and each line there is a connection, with the green lines being positive and the red lines being negative associations. And because the oranges there associate more closely with each other than the blues, you can probably very safely say that they are distinct categories. And that is something that is preserved from one time point to the next, and so you can say it's stable. And this is the kind of importance of longitudinal network analysis. You can see where things are distinct, but also we can see what influences what's closer to what's central in that network, what has a lot of nodes and connections to other things, and so on. It really gives us a fine view of the concept, the disorder, and its effect on itself. Now, as you saw there with that network, that's exactly what I did with my results, with the data I got from my participants. The 6 SMA symptoms were mapped in just such a way, alongside the 3 distress subtypes across 2 time points, as you see here. And a number of coefficients were examined, and tests ran on these networks to determine the characteristics of both, whether they differed, and what these networks could tell us about the way problematic social media use is experienced and what can be done to treat it. And a lot of discoveries were actually made in this particular study. We found both the networks were stable, both in their own time point. They were the individual coefficients that we looked at, the associations, the structure of the networks. They were stable, and they were stable across time. They didn't change. Here you can see it graphically. It's portrayed differently here. The program spat out a slightly different graphic, but it's really just the same network rotated a couple degrees. Rotated 90 degrees. It's not different. And so that has a lot of implications all in of itself. But we also found that these two distinct, that across both these time points, there were 2 distinct subnetworks which had significantly stronger relationships within themselves than between themselves, which meant that the construct of social media addiction held together in the network, remained constant as relationships over time, and did not appear to be a secondary symptom of distress, which once again lent support to the model, to the behavioural addiction model. This also meant that when you're looking at these networks, You have to kind of examine the similarities between them. If it's stable across time, and we've statistically determined that through a difference test, then any differences you see from one network to the next is probably just statistical noise. It doesn't really exist. You are looking at the similarities, what remain constant, that's what's real. That's what's real. And so what we found was certain edges, which I've highlighted there, were significantly stronger than others. The edges between stress and other distress symptoms, the edges between the symptoms of salience and tolerance, which might imply a connection between the two. Maybe they're similar, maybe they measure the same thing. We also found that the second symptom, tolerance, had significantly higher centrality in the network. It had more of a formative impact on the other symptoms. When you develop a tolerance, the other symptoms come. And we found that SMA, the addiction of social media, interacted with distress primarily through the symptom of mood modification. Alright, and that's just showing you the way that this testing is done. You kind of, you look at a graph of expected influence. It's a coefficient that tells you how central it is, or bridge expected influence, which tells you what's connective, where are the connections between one network and the other. And you just kind of pick out the peaks and the troughs, and you then run a difference test to try and determine whether or not there's a statistically significant difference between those troughs and peaks and the rest of the data. And in this case, we found that there were. Now, what does this mean? What does this all imply? Well, once again, social media addiction is implied to be a unitary and predictive construct, which is supported as distinct from distress. It's not a secondary symptom. We found that tolerance and mood modification seem to have undue influence in the network, and with mood modification in particular serve as a bridge, which makes a lot of sense. When you feel the need to start changing your moods with social media, you probably might cause yourself some anxiety, maybe feeling some distress, depression, so on. It makes sense. But tolerance seems to be the thing that starts it all, the originator. When do you start having an addiction? When is your use really problematic? When you start having to use more and more to get the same effect. What does all this mean? Well, we can see that certain symptoms have an outsized effect in the network, tolerance, which means that if you treat that, it's probably going to have a very powerful effect on the other symptoms of that network. So it helps with assessment, helps with the treatment, helps prevention. At every step of treating SMA, addressing tolerance first is always going to be a good move. And if you see distress presenting at the same time, we probably want to attack mood modification as well to try and address the distress side of it, to try and maybe head it off. And so here I just have a little summary of everything that I found, all the different things that I've done in answering the question, what is the structure of problematic digital media use, and does it support the behavioral addiction model? But you've already seen all this. You've already seen everything I've done. I think what's more important is the overall findings. What did I find? What was the answer? The answer is yes, the behavioral addiction model is supported. Distinct subgroups of digital media addiction exist. They take the form of severity subgroups, and this is the same for internet gaming disorder and social media addiction. These profiles relate predictably to measures of convergent validity, like social engagement and distress. There doesn't appear to be any distinction between tech and behavioral addictions. And social media addiction symptoms form a stable network which is distinct from distress. all of which indicates the behavioral addiction model of problematic digital media use is supported. It's measuring something. It's measuring something, and it's something with clinical ramifications. It's something that can be put to use. Which all really indicates that these people, the people who theorize that the behavioral addiction model was a thing, that this salient, easy use substance, the internet, which in all ways behaves similarly to the drug in terms of environmental mismatch, at least evolutionary mismatch. The people who saw this and theorized, well, this is obviously an addictive substance, they were probably correct. I say probably because it is science, and these are just indications at the end of the day. But it seems like the most likely explanation. That being said, it has to be noted that this study over-relied on archived datasets. It's not your experimental. Everything's reliant on self-report, survey-based research. There's really no examination of problematic digital media use from non-behavioral addiction-based models. We haven't checked those. Maybe they're right. It probably is the case. It really probably is the case that motivations and contexts and things like that, individual traits, have an effect on the way that we use social media and video games and digital media, and you can't really rule them out until you've tested them themselves. All we can do is say, this behavioral model seems to be doing something right. It seems to be measuring something real. And so I really think that the profiling of digital media addiction should be extended longitudinally. Growth mixture modeling, the stuff I did in my first two studies. I really think there should be experimental research into, do these clinical implications have real world applications? Is it real? Theory is great and all, but if it doesn't have an actual effect on anything, then it's kind of pointless. But also, we should be trying to check if these other models have something to say, and they probably do, and they probably shouldn't be discounted, but we can't know until we've tested it, kind of like I've done with this one. Now, a bit more boring stuff, the admin. My particular project is this end phase. I've completed 3 out of 3 studies, the body of this paper, of this thesis. I simply have to complete the linking sections, the conclusion, and just put it all together into one document. This should be done sometime December, January. That's probably a very hopeful estimate, probably February, March next year. That's it. That's my very, very long presentation done. And I just want to thank anyone who's actually taken the time to listen to this. And I especially want to thank just everyone who's helped me along the way. All my supervisors, Vas, Rapson, Jo, Bruno. These people have really been my rocks. They've guided me so much. So much of what I do, it comes from them. The professionalism, the statistics that I enjoy going over, my passion for this year. It really does come from them, and without them, I would have been able to do nothing. I'd also like to thank friends and family who've been very tolerant of the fact that I've basically disappeared for 3 years. And you, the listener, for actually managing to get through this, if you did. Thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of the day. Q&A. No Q&A.